Welcome to Tales from the Training Room, Burkett's bite-sized podcast series from the Shaping Excellence team. In this episode, Sam Greenhalgh and Johnny Shevlane discuss some key lessons for employers when considering long-term ill health. They look at some common pitfalls and how to avoid disability discrimination. Both Sam and Johnny are members of the Shaping Excellence team, our training department. Sam, as partner, leads the team, and Johnny is our dedicated employment law trainer. They begin by discussing the Equality Act definition of disability.
So we're going to be looking at three, and I've been limited to three by Sam, three lessons for managing long-term sickness absence effectively. Should we move on to the first key lesson, Sam? We can talk around it.
Yep.
The first key lesson is be diligent when considering sickness absence records and absence triggers. So let's take a step back for a second. We're talking about disability discrimination. What is the definition of disability under the Equality Act, very, very briefly?
Well, if we take an even bigger step back, when we're dealing with absence management in the workplace, one of the factors we've got to consider is whether that individual is disabled or not. Now, if they are disabled, there are additional protections that they are entitled to and steps that an employer has to take in order to discharge all of their legal obligations.
So the definition of disability is a mental or physical impairment which has a substantial adverse effect. An adverse effect, I think, is probably a better way of looking at it, on the way someone lives their day-to-day lives, their normal day-to-day activities. And by normal day-to-day activities, what do we mean by that, Sam?
Getting dressed.
Yeah. Walking.
Boiling an egg.
Yeah,
just basic care needs, basic survival needs. Don't forget that test is applied without the benefit of any medication, any treatments, any therapies that individual may suffer from. So I always use the example of my friend Harry. My friend Harry is diabetic and he has to inject himself with insulin. Now, Harry is able to live a perfectly normal life. He is not impacted in any way as a result of his diabetes, but if you were to take his insulin away from him, he would very quickly start developing symptoms that would mean his condition would have a substantial adverse impact on his normal day-to-day activities. So you have to apply the test for disability without the benefit of any treatment. So Harry, in that case, would be disabled. He is disabled under the meaning of the Equality Act. So sometimes disabilities can be hidden and masked by treatment or medication that an individual is receiving.
Yeah, and that's quite a hard part to get your heads around. It's certainly been a hard part for people I've been training to get their heads around, because they think if you've been able to treat yourself in order to avoid the impact of your condition, it doesn't seem necessarily fair on the employer that you can therefore claim that you're disabled.
Yeah.
But this is just the first element of the test. Are you disabled? Does the employer have knowledge? Is the next element of the test. You can have clear, obvious knowledge which is given to you by the employee, but sometimes you have to look at things like somebody's absence record to work out whether or not there might be a disability there. And there's this concept of implied knowledge.
Yes.
And sometimes an employer will have implied knowledge.
Yeah. The other thing we should just mention is that in order for a condition to be a disability, once you've got through all those stages, it would need to be long term. So it would need to be lasting 12 months or more. That's the definition of long term, or likely to last for 12 months or more. Or maybe it could be a recurring condition over a period of 12 months. Knowledge is a very difficult one sometimes, because you could have the case in point with Harry, in that he's disclosed it in his application form for employment. I am diabetic, and that is controlled and managed. But often employers think, oh well, if it's not in the form, that means they're not disabled, and we're not going to manage that at all. And it's well known that there's still, unfortunately, a stigma attached to disclosing medical conditions to your employer for fear of being rejected or having that offer of employment withdrawn. So we don't just rely on what is in the application form. We have to understand how they're interacting and how they're behaving in the workplace that gives us any potential knowledge of disability. And one of the key signposts to that is sickness absence.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's lots of different, we're talking or touching maybe in the area of mental ill health here, because it can be a mental impairment just as much as a physical impairment. And most of the conditions which we're talking about as hidden conditions, or at least some of those conditions, are mental health conditions. So it's not somebody in a wheelchair or somebody with mobility problems which we're talking about. It's talking about somebody who perhaps has is depressed or has anxiety, those kind of situations. So with those kind of situations, an employee might have a higher level of sickness absence. That can be one of the indicators for the employer. And there might be something from their return to work assessments which gives an indication that the individual is suffering from a mental health condition, or perhaps they are neurodiverse and they are struggling at the moment because of one of the things that's happening in the workplace towards them. So one of the things that a lot of employers have are sickness absence triggers. So they will say that for an individual, if an individual is going to be off for 10 days in the course of a 12-month period, then their sickness absence is going to be managed in a way which might feel a bit intimidating for the employee. What do you think about those sickness absence triggers? Do you think they're good things to have in place, or do you think we need to be slightly wary about them?
I think they're a useful tool for helping to flag an absence management issue, and they're well regarded and well used by employers, albeit in different guises and at different levels. But I think often employers will sometimes rely exclusively on those triggers in order to manage absence. So if you've been absent for 6 times in a year, you get a warning. And so on and so forth as you go throughout that period of employment. And actually you need to look at the absences and to decide, as part of that caring for that employee, that duty of care that an employer has, and also to try and prevent further absences in the future and the impact on the business, is to look at how you can best support that individual. And if there is a disability there, then there may be adjustments that you are obliged to make if there isn't, if there is something in the workplace that is presenting a disadvantage to that individual. So
yeah, absolutely. And those return to work meetings are really, really important. We want to make sure that they're quite detailed, they're carried out very, very compassionately, but also carried out in a way in which we're trying to establish what's actually going on with an individual. Because as you say, there can be instances where an individual is trying to hide the fact that they are suffering from something at work. And in the UK, and I had this discussion actually yesterday in a training room, we have this stiff upper lip mentality, or certainly some of the older generation have a stiff upper lip mentality. They're struggling with something, but they don't want to tell anyone because they don't want to seem to others that they're struggling.
Yeah.
That kind of comes into conflict with some of the protections which are there for people who are disabled under the Equality Act. So we want to try and drill down and try and work out what's actually going on, because it might be that we need to be making adjustments for people in that situation. I'm going to move on to our second point that I wanted to raise today. A good occupational health assessment is priceless. That's what I'm saying in relation to occupational health assessment.
This is one of my bugbears, isn't it? You know this is one of my bugbears.
Yeah.
So we come across from time to time clients who ring us up and say, we've had this issue with this employee, we've sent them off to occupational health, and occupational health are sitting on the fence. Mm-hmm. They don't give us an answer. They don't say whether we can sack them or whether we can't. And I say, well, that's because it's not occupational health's decision to make. That's a management decision to make. And the best way of getting the best result from your occupational health provider is to give them the full amount of information that they need in order to be able to make an assessment. Because very often, all they will see is the referral form and the employee who sits in front of them. And sometimes employers can feel that the occupational health report is a verbatim record of what the employee has told the occupational health advisor. So the best thing that an employer can do is to put time and effort into that occupational health referral, include attachments such as job descriptions, the types of work that is being completed. You need to explain to occupational health, who don't work in your business, what it is you do, what it is the employee does, to get the best possible response in a report.
And even if they do sit within the business in some way, shape or form, they don't sit within your particular department, in your particular team, so they
Absolutely.
don't have that detailed knowledge that the manager has of what the person does.
Yeah.
And equally, they don't have knowledge of what is and what is possible in terms of adjustments. So you
Yes.
need to give them an idea about where the flex points might be in terms of what is possible for your organisation to do in terms of adjusting that person's role to make it something that allows them to continue in the workplace or not. And that's the key part in relation to occupational health providers and in terms of occupational health assessments. There are also bad occupational health providers and good occupational health providers. If you're doing everything you can as a HR department and your occupational health assessment is still quite poor, then you might need to look around and think about whether or not there are other providers out there who can provide a more detailed and more thorough report.
But I also think, you could request a conversation with that occupational health advisor as opposed to doing it by a form filling exercise as well. That can be quite useful to for employers.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen a recent judgment in which an occupational health report was massively criticised for being very, very brief, very lacking in detail, obviously lacking in detailed knowledge of the individual's condition. We want to avoid those kind of occupational health providers, but how much is that on the provider themselves and how much is it on the quality of information we've provided them? The last point I wanted to tackle today is that not every adjustment requested by an employee will always be reasonable. And it's one of the points which I've mentioned before in relation to this training which we deliver. Reasonable adjustments are adjustments which we have to make if we know an employee, if we have the knowledge that an employee is disabled from an employer's perspective. A failure to make these adjustments would be a disability discrimination. It would class as disability discrimination. So the key question is, what do we mean by reasonable? And quite often an employee has an idea of the adjustment that they want you to make. And sometimes that's a perfectly reasonable adjustment. It's something which is well within the things that you could do as an employer. You can easily do that kind of adjustment, but sometimes it's not. What do we say about the employee's ability to feed in relation to reasonable adjustments?
Well, the employee is a stakeholder in that process, and obviously they are in a contractual relationship with the employer. So by all means, their input to that process is very, very valuable. But it is not the only factor. And what I would urge employers to go back to is consider what is the disadvantage that is being suffered by the employee as a result of their disability. And would the adjustment actually fix that disadvantage or ameliorate it to a certain extent to allow the employee to do their role?
And employers can also take into account the costs of ameliorating that disadvantage.
They can, but there's a kind of a cost plus argument that employers need to develop to say, well, it's going to cost us this amount of money, but and also it's not going to meet the needs because of this, for example. Or maybe the classic is you need to install a lift because I need to work on the second floor and I can't climb the stairs. and the employer says, well, we're not going to do that because that's going to be hugely costly, and actually we've got a listed building, it's not possible to do that, we can't get permissions to do that.
But in that situation, can we find a place for the individual to work on the ground floor, for example? Because that would be the reasonable adjustment for our organisation in that situation. Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing we need to think about in terms of cost is there any financial assistance which we could maybe tap into in order to address that cost, access to work, those kind of provisions which are in place. So they are the big factors for today. Obviously, we could talk about this topic for hours and hours and hours, but so that's...
Can I just add one final thing in there? And we didn't mention it at the beginning, but it's something that is worth reiterating, is just because you do not believe or they may not have a disability does not mean to say that the employer isn't under a duty to support and help that employee in coping with whatever health condition that they have got, because there are other claims that they may have, such as constructive dismissal, unfair dismissal, etc., which would and of course the duty of care, which needs to be considered carefully. So it is not a simple process to follow.
That was Sam Greenhalgh and Jonny Shevlane discussing long-term employee sickness. If you found this episode of Tales from the Training Room useful, our Shaping Excellence team has a whole host of employment training courses available. Our training is practical, insightful, and always provided by the best legal professionals. Head to our Shaping Excellence training page at burkitts.co.uk to find out more. This podcast has been produced by Burkitts. The content of this podcast is for general information only. It is not and should not be taken as legal advice. If you require any further information in relation to this podcast, please contact us in the first instance via our website, burkitts.co.uk.